Well, hello, welcome to day 5, and today we're going to be looking at the book of Leviticus. Now, I don't know what your first thoughts are when you hear the word Leviticus. In fact, I can guess what your first thought might be when you hear the word Leviticus. It may be something you've avoided altogether. It may be something you've dipped into and thought, what on earth is this about? I don't understand this, or I don't like this, and may well have passed on very quickly. Don't skip on past this video. Give me a few minutes to try and persuade you that there is some stuff in Leviticus that is really helpful for us and really useful for us to understand. And then actually it's a lot more interesting than you might think. Let me give you, first of all, an outline of this book. Now, there's various outlines being proposed, but this is one that seems to work quite well in terms of the structure of what it contains. Leviticus essentially contains laws. It contains a sort of wider expression of the laws that are summarised in Exodus, and it's kind of the law. It begins to be set out in Exodus, and the book of Leviticus collects a whole set more of them. We'll talk about what types of law they are as we go through. So Leviticus sets out laws and procedures for how to behave in certain situations. So a broad outline of this book might be this. The first 7 chapters might be regarded as a manual of how to do sacrifice. I'll talk more about sacrifice in a few minutes. Chapters 8 to 10 are a manual of priesthood. They are instructions to the priests, how they're to conduct themselves and so on. Then we get, in chapters 11 to 15, we get what might be described as a manual of purity. And we'll talk a bit about what we mean by purity in a few minutes. In chapter 16, a very important chapter, we have what might be called the Manual of Atonement, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a few minutes. Then chapters 17 to 26 might be called a Manual of Holiness, which is similar to the purity idea, but not identical, as we'll see in a minute. And then chapter 27 is a manual of dedication. It's about how to bring voluntary offerings to the Lord, things that you just want to give God because you love him. Now, there are some key ideas in Leviticus which might be helpful for us to understand, and these are not ideas that are being described so much as almost assumed, to some extent anyway. This is kind of part of the worldview of this ancient people. Sometimes we say the past is another country, but if we read back to the times in which Leviticus is written, or times in which it is set, this is not another country, this is another planet. They think very, very differently to us. I'll try and show you some clues about that as we go along. But essentially, if and when we encounter things that we just don't understand, the answer may well be because they think so very differently from the way we think. So some of these things to flag up to you. In Leviticus, there is an idea of a geography of holiness. So, and we spoke about this a little bit yesterday with the tabernacle. So if I begin in the centre of the tabernacle, we have this tent within a tent called the most holy place. And only the high priest is allowed to go there, only once a year. And a sacrifice is made there once a year, which is never eaten. Okay. Now come out from that most holy tent, most holy place, to the holy place. Sort of immediately surrounding it, if you like. Now, who's allowed to go there? Not just the high priest this time, but all of the priesthood are allowed there. What happens there? Well, sacrifices also happen there, but they can be eaten by the priests. And when can that happen? Not just once a year, as in the most holy place, but this can happen on festivals and on the Sabbath. Sacrifices can be offered there. Now, come back a bit further to the kind of courtyard of the area of the tabernacle, and later on of the temple, and this is the place where you might meet the priest with your sacrifice, as we'll hear in a minute. This again we've stepped back again in this geography of holiness. So who's allowed to come here? Not just the priests, but the whole Levitical tribe. So the priests are a subsection of the tribe of the Levites, but all of the Levites are allowed into this court, and any clean Israelite. We'll talk about what cleanness means in a minute, but any clean Israelite can come here. Sacrifices can be made, not just by the priests, but also by the people, and anyone can eat some of those sacrifices. So you might go and sacrifice an animal and share the meat with your family. And when can this happen? This can happen on ordinary days. So in the most holy place, only the high priest, only on the Day of Atonement, meat not eaten. Holy place, priests making sacrifices on festivals, and they can eat the meat. In the courtyard, any clean Israelite can make a sacrifice any day of the week, and they can eat the meat themselves. Now, if you move outside again, then we've moved beyond the kind of encampment of Israel. And we've moved into the encampment of Israel, I beg your pardon. And in this place, minor impurities can be dealt with, and purification rituals can take place within the camp itself. And then beyond the camp are places where you put things, or indeed people, who are have significant impurity. And purification from being outside the camp takes 7 days, whereas purification for a minor impurity that can be contained within the camp takes 1 day. So I hope you can see this kind of idea, this graded holiness, this geography of holiness that works from the most holy place outwards. That's the first idea that Leviticus kind of describes and kind of assumes and wants us to understand. Now, the next thing, as I've already referred to once or twice, are certain categories of thought which are operative within this world. And there are two in particular I want to flag up, and they are not the same, but they're not entirely different either. They kind of overlap with one another. And so the first category is the idea of what is holy compared to what is common. So something that is holy is set apart for God. Something that is common can be just used in normal ways and we can interact with it in normal ways. So there's that kind of distinction. But then there's also the clean and unclean distinction. Something that is clean is something that can just be treated normally. Something that is unclean is defiled and needs to be purified. And defilement can sometimes be temporary, as I've referred to already, and sometimes it is permanent. So to kind of show you an example of this, take a Levite man who is an ordinary man. He is consecrated as a priest. Now he is holy. Okay, this is his category. It's not actually a description of his ethics or anything else, although his ethics and his conduct should match that. But it's not a description of that. It's a description of his category. He's moved from the common category into the holy category. But if he does something that defiles him, like he touches a dead body, then he becomes unclean, and he then goes into the unclean category. So kind of that's sort of how it operates. Now, let me say a little bit about the types of law that we see in Leviticus. Now, you may well have heard it said that there are 3 sorts of laws that we encounter in the Hebrew Bible. Ritual laws, to do with sacrifices and temple offerings and so on. Civic laws, to do with how you conduct yourself in society. And moral laws, and it's the moral laws which continue to be operative. Now, there's no justification for this in Leviticus. There is no distinction drawn between, these 3 categories don't seem to exist. Because the Hebrew view of life, the biblical view of life, is that it is integrated. That what I do with my body affects my standing before God, affects my soul. What I do with the way I conduct myself in society also affects my soul, affects my goodness, my purity, and so on. So all of these things are integral. And so the idea that you would have laws for different elements of life there would be quite an alien thought, actually. It's better to try and understand the principles behind the laws in order to try and understand how they might be speaking to us today as Christians, but I'll come back to that towards the end. As you read Leviticus, if you do, you will see 2 different sorts of laws. And the technical term for these are the apodictic laws and the casuistic laws. Let me explain that. Apodictic laws are laws that prohibit things. The classic example would be in the 10 Commandments, which we often render as "thou shalt not," and that's an apodictic law. Casuistic law is phrased differently. It's case law. It's if this happens, then this is how you are to respond. If you lend your ox to a neighbour and the ox dies, then this is what you're to do. If your neighbour is indebted and gives you his borrows money from you and gives you his coat as a pledge of that debt, this is how you are to respond. The answer to that one, by the way, is you give it back to him every night, because it's not just his coat, it's his duvet. That's casuistic law, and certainly with casuistic law, I think it's helpful to understand that although they are giving us particular examples, they are intended to be applied more widely. They are for instances to help us to understand the way that this law is operative. So the law about if I lend my ox to my neighbour would equally apply if I lend my donkey to my neighbour, or perhaps if I lend a pot to my neighbour, if that makes sense. It's a for instance. So those are the types of laws that we meet in Leviticus. Now, let me pull out some particular things to discuss with you that we find in this book. First of all, I want to say a fair bit about sacrifice. We make sacrifices to things that matter to us. We all do it. It is an inherent part of being human. In order to make this video, I have sacrificed a fair chunk of my time this morning doing some research and preparing this and now recording it. We make sacrifices for things that matter. We always do it. In the ancient world, where everybody always believes in a deity of some sort or multiple deities, then you naturally make sacrifices to your god. That's one thing to say about sacrifice. Another thing to say about sacrifice is sometimes we are horrified when we read about animal sacrifice. And I would challenge you, if you are not a vegetarian, that actually our horror needs to be tempered by a humility of the fact that animals are sacrificed routinely in this country and worldwide to human appetites, whether it's to eat, or for leather, or for pharmaceutical testing, and so on, or for intensive farming practice, and for as farming implements, as it were. We use animals. If we are going to say that this system of sacrifice is abhorrent, we're going to need to become vegans. Otherwise, there's an inconsistency there. Let me say a little bit about the types of sacrifice that we encounter in the book of Leviticus. At the beginning, we read about 3 different types of voluntary sacrifice. No one's going to come and force you to make these. You make them as an act of thanksgiving, as an expression of religious devotion, of love, sometimes in order to seal a vow. And the 3 types of sacrifice are called the whole burnt offering. With the whole burnt offering, you yourself, anyone, male or female, brings an animal. There's certain rules around what animals you can bring and so on. Brings an animal to the door of the tabernacle, to the gateway of the tabernacle. And there you kill it yourself. And you hand it over to the priests, and the whole thing is burnt as an act of love. We need to remember this is a pre-money society, and wealth had legs in those days. Wealth was portable in that sense. So giving over an animal to be burnt up to God was like making a financial offering. That's number 1. Number 2 is a grain offering, which is conducted in some rather the same way as a whole burnt offering, but it's not an animal that's offered. As you hear, it's an offering of grain, sometimes described as a poor person's burnt offering. Seems to sort of occupy the same function, and perhaps to be offered by those who couldn't afford to bring a whole animal. And then there is another offering, which is variously described depending on which part of Leviticus you're reading, or which part of the Bible you're reading, and which translation you're using, as a peace offering, a fellowship offering, or a well-being offering. And these are all descriptions of the same thing. Once again, anyone can bring this. You kill it yourself, you give it to the priests. Part of it is burnt on the altar. The fattest part, the best part, is burnt on the altar. And the rest of it is eaten by the community. This, I like to think, is a little bit like roasting your turkey for Christmas Day. And then you eat it together as part of a family celebration. So these are the voluntary offerings. Then we have 2 that are mandated. First of all, we have the sin offering. Now, a sin offering is made for unintentional sin, especially failure to fulfill a religious duty of some sort. And there are different offerings and different descriptions of the protocol for different categories of people. So there's one for the high priest, there's one for the community of Israel, there's one for individuals, and so on. This offering is also used to purify someone who is ritually unclean after childbirth, if you've been healed of leprosy, if you've had a bodily discharge. So there is an overlapping category of ideas here of between sin and impurity. And they're not the same, but they kind of overlap. That's the sin offering. The guilt offering is made for guilt. Now, whether that is for an objective sense of being guilty before God or a sense of feeling guilty is slightly unclear. But it seems to be used for sacrilege, for unfaithfulness, and for disobedience. And with these offerings, you bring the animal, you kill it yourself, but then the priest takes it off you and does things with the blood and so on. And there is one strand of thought which I think is helpful for us to understand, that one of the things that this offering is doing is not so much purifying the person who brings it as purifying the tabernacle, which is somehow polluted by people's actions. What do these things teach us? They teach us that sin and guilt matter to God. They teach us that guilt is paralysing and we need to be released from it. They teach us that God is holy and takes sin very seriously. And they also teach us that God makes provision for guilt and sin. So that's a little bit about sacrifices in Leviticus. I want to say something about the framework of the way people are thinking in this world. And this is to do with, we tend to think very much as post-Enlightenment thinkers, people who've been trained up by Enlightenment thinking. We tend to think very much in cause and effect and in terms of what we would consider very rational ways of thinking. Now, the ancient worldview is very different from that. They're not less intelligent at all, but they think in different categories. And they think what might be called analogically. They think of this is like that, and you and I may not immediately see the connection. Let me give you an example. In Leviticus 2, you'll read that honey and yeast, in other words, leavened bread, can't be mixed with sacrifices. Why, we might say. In Leviticus 11, we read that teeming animals, so animals that swarm on the land, in the sky and in the waters, are to be regarded as forbidden. Why, we might say. In Leviticus 15, we read that menstrual blood or having a seminal emission both make somebody unclean, in the sense that they have to be treated as a part. Why, we might say. The answer to these things actually may all be linked, and there is it's complicated to go into. I don't want to go into it in a lot of detail. But once again, going back to Genesis 1, where God blesses humanity and also blesses the world and says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And there's something deeply in the worldview of these people that understands the sanctity of life, and that the sanctity of that kind of fecund proliferation of life. Now, they see that in honey and leaven. Honey, which enables you to ferment things. Leaven, which enables bread to rise. They see that kind of something about proliferation, something about, don't think microbiologically here, but think about something about teeming life, about something that kind of bubbles up and seems to have a life of its own. Teeming animals that swarm, like not plagues, but kind of great swarms of them, whether flying animals or ones that crawl on the ground. They kind of represent this glorious fecundity of creation. Blood is always understood as having the life force within it. And of course, seminal emission contains the life force which enables the next generation. So all of these things somehow represent this idea of fecundity, which God has blessed and God has caused to be has called us to respect, honour, venerate, I should say, respect, honour. And maybe that these prohibitions and these rules relate all to that simple idea. So that's kind of a little bit about how the patterns of thought operate. Now, I'd like to say something briefly about the law of Talion. The law of Talion is, you're probably more likely to know it as an eye for an eye. Let me just read you a description of the law of Talion from Leviticus 24. It says this: "If anyone takes the life of a human being, he must be put to death. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. If anyone injures his neighbour, whatever he has done must be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has injured the other, so he is to be injured." Now, we often think of that as harsh and brutal and unforgiving, but there's a few things to say. First of all, we notice that the punishment exactly matches the offence. That if I injure somebody in their arm, I don't pay for it with my life. So there's a limitation here around vengeance or around punishment that can be exercised. The next thing to say is that the punishment is paid back upon the person who did the offence, not upon their relatives or upon their whole clan or anything like that. Now, this law has its echoes in some of the other ancient Near Eastern laws that were around, but many of those laws would go far beyond this in the punishment that they would allow. They would allow, for example, for punishment of a man who rapes a woman to be raping his wife. Now, that would not fit into the law of Talion. You and I think, would find that utterly abhorrent. If a man builds a house in one of these other ancient laws, not in the Bible, if a man builds a house and the house is badly constructed, falls down and kills people, his family are to have their own house pulled down upon their head. The law of Talion, as the law of an eye for an eye, as the book of Leviticus, as the Hebrew Bible describes it, is much more constrained than that. It is to be exercised in a judicial sense. It also puts a high value upon life. Life is costly. It matters if you take someone's life, and therefore you pay for it with your own. Now, this isn't to say that me saying this isn't to say that I think we should do capital punishment these days. Our options are much wider these days in terms of incarceration, in terms of judicial process. But for its day, this represents a substantial limitation of personal vengeance, and we should notice that, I think. Just a few more things to say before I finish. Let me say a little bit about atonement. So I've talked about sin offerings and guilt offerings, but the Day of Atonement was different again. The Day of Atonement was the day, I've already referred to it briefly, when the high priest went into the most holy place once a year to make atonement for the sins of the nation. This is called Yom Kippur. The Day of Atonement, that's what that means. It's a day, it's called a high holy day in the Jewish calendar still. It is a day of fasting. It's a day when the high priest would go in hoping that his offering would be acceptable to the God who, as we learnt yesterday, calls people into relationship with him, and yet inherently relationship with him is perilous. And so the high priest would go in, I think, quaking for his own life and wondering whether the sacrifice would be accepted. We read about that in Leviticus 16. Now, if that sacrifice was accepted, if the high priest got away with his life, then he would come out and horns, shofar, it was called a shofar, a ram's horn like this, would be blown. And that would first of all announce that atonement had been obtained and the nation had been forgiven for another year. But it also, every seventh year, would be the beginning of the Sabbath year. A Sabbath year is a day when you allow your land to be in furlough and you eat the natural produce of the land rather than farming it. And every 50th year, so every 7 cycles of 7, would be the Jubilee year. Jubilee is the most wonderful idea. Read Leviticus 25 if you want to learn more about it. Let me just say a couple of things very, very briefly. In the Jubilee year, everyone returns to their family property. You're not allowed to dispose of your patrimonial land, your family property, permanently. If you've had to sell it because you're desperate for money, it comes back to you in the Jubilee year. If you've had to take a loan because you're desperately poor, the debt is cancelled in the Jubilee year. If you have had to sell yourself into sort of bonded labour because you are desperately poor, you are freed in the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year was a system, we don't know if it was ever actually done, but in principle, it was a system that prevented the poverty, the gap between rich and poor from getting wider and wider and wider and wider year by year by year by year. Because every 50 years, it went back. Land was returned, debts were cancelled, people were freed. It was a wonderful year. Finally, what might we think about if we want to read Leviticus as a Christian? Lots we could say about this, but a couple of things. Jesus did not overturn these laws. He fulfilled them. He fulfilled the requirements himself. He actually raises the bar. You've seen it, if you read in Matthew 5, he says again and again, you have heard that it was said to you, that's a reference to the laws and Exodus and Leviticus, but I say to you. So you have heard that it was said to you, do not murder. I say to you, do not hold anger against your brother. You have heard it was said to you, do not commit adultery. I say to you, do not look lustfully upon somebody else. So Jesus doesn't say, never mind the law, he raises the bar on it. The message of Leviticus, I think, to Christians, as it was to its original readers, God is holy and he calls his people to be holy. Again and again, we hear this refrain. Leviticus 11:44 is one place, but we read it many places in this book. Be holy, for I am holy, says God. Sounds a bit like what Jesus says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. The book of Leviticus helps us to understand the holiness of God, but also that he makes provision for sin and for guilt. And therefore, as a Christian reader, I believe this book points me towards Jesus, to how much we need a saviour, and to what he is one day going to do on the cross.